Well, as you rightly say, I'm really here to depress you. I think you've just heard from Jim a sort of up and down picture of things that are going right and things that are going wrong. I'm going to speak exclusively about the UK and the problems we face in the public sector. And I want to paint you a picture which is considerably bleaker than that portrayed in the autumn statement last Wednesday. I think that there are serious and systemic problems with the sustainability of our public sector and that these are not being properly addressed. The headlines of the autumn statement by George Osborne last week was basically the sun continues to shine. The forecasts he'd received from the Office for Budget Responsibility were so optimistic, both in terms of likely future tax revenues and, at least from George Osborne's perspective, low interest rates, that he had in effect found £27 billion down the back of his sofa and was no longer requiring to make some of the dramatic cuts to public spending, so-called dramatic cuts to public spending, that had been envisaged. So a mere 4 or 5 weeks previously, he was, for example, saying that there had to be dramatic cuts to working tax credits of about £4 billion or so a year, miraculously owing to the suddenly rosy forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility. That was no longer the case. But despite the fact that we are told we live in an age of austerity and belt tightening, the truth is, on the present figures, if you believe them, government spending will actually go up over the course of this Parliament, in real terms, by a fraction, by a smidgen, by about 0.3%. In cash terms, at the end of the Parliament, the government will be spending something like £850 billion per annum. And large parts of this expenditure is now effectively protected. The National Health Service, the police budget is no longer being cut. Schools protected on a per-pupil basis. International development, we have to spend 0.7% of GDP on international development. Pensions, not only ring-fenced, but a ratchet effect, the so-called triple lock, which means that they're going to go up and up and up by inflation 2.5% or real wage growth, whichever is the most. And we've seen quite major increases in certain areas of spending since George Osborne became Chancellor in 2010. Welfare up, health spending up, international development, albeit a small part of the budget, up substantially. This is an indication of what spending will look like. This is in cash terms, not in real terms. And the blue bars show you, if you like, the update that we received from the Chancellor last Wednesday. The orange bars show what he was anticipating to do in his budget in July. Spending on the rise. That is in cash terms, not in real terms. But as I say, by the end of the Parliament, about £850 billion or so of public spending. There was optimism, huge optimism, in what the Chancellor told us on Wednesday. He is expecting growth of about 2.5% per annum between now and the end of the decade, within a decimal point or so. If he and the Office for Budget Responsibility are right about that, that will be the longest period of sustained growth above 2% in my lifetime. He is anticipating that interest rates will remain very low, won't go up as fast as he was previously anticipating, thereby meaning that servicing our debt is considerably cheaper. He has not built in any real considerations about the international picture, other than it being generally benign. If there is an absolute crash or crisis in the eurozone, he hasn't factored that in. So he's really sort of focusing on his year-on-year budgetary position, and apparently had colossally good news for us on Wednesday. Of course, his criticism was of the previous government, of the previous Labour administration, was they did not fix the roof when the sun was shining, that they were running deficits in the budget whilst the economy was doing well, thereby meaning that when the crash happened, the UK government was not in a good position to deal with it, or as Warren Buffett put it rather elegantly, when the tide goes out, you get to see who is swimming naked. And that was emphatically the position of the UK's government's finances. But really, the message from George Osborne last Wednesday was we don't really need to fix the roof because we consider it likely that the sun will continue to shine over the next 4 or 5 years. There's no need for any surgery. We are in for a bout, apparently, of glorious, benign, sunny weather. Looking at, I showed you that public spending will go up in cash terms, but this graph shows you the size of the public sector overall in 2010 sterling. I was born just a year after this graph started. When I was born, about £200 billion in 2010 pounds were being spent by the public sector. It has been an inexorable rise, really. If a Martian came down and looked at the state of British public finances over the last 40 or 45 years, he would find it very difficult to pick out of that graph when we had governments of a Conservative inclination or a Labour inclination. It has been a pretty consistent upward rise in government spending, and there is no sign of that stopping. Yet sometimes it flatlines. It's never really gone down. Sometimes it ratchets up a bit higher than previously, but it's not far off being a straight line graph of increased government spending over the past 45 years or so, and I don't believe there's any reason to think that that will cease. Again, in the name of austerity, we've apparently had or are about to have or witnessed in the last Parliament extraordinarily savage cuts. Not the case at all if you were to look at what's now called the social protection budget. I usually call that welfare, the health budget, the education budget, and debt repayment, I've called it, but I'm being rather generous there. It's really just debt servicing. This shows you what's happened over the last 4 or 5 years and is likely to happen over the next 12 months. There's no major change, but there hasn't been, I don't think, again, a Martian coming down to look at the British economy would look at those sort of numbers and say that there have been savage and dramatic cuts to UK government spending. Nothing of the sort. The welfare budget has edged up somewhat, now north of £200 billion. It's about £10,000 per household per year in the United Kingdom, just in transfer payments, taking money from certain demographics and giving it to others. Health, ring-fenced and ratcheted up. That's going to go up with more than inflation. Education, more or less flatlined, but certainly no dramatic reductions there. And the cost of servicing our debt has edged up a little over the last 5 years and has no real sign of going down shortly, and could actually be a major problem if we do see substantial rises in interest rates. The reason I showed you that previous graph is if you're serious about getting government spending under control, you have to really look at the blue slice of this pie. If you look at the health budget, the education budget, and the welfare budget, including state pensions, out-of-work benefits, in-work benefits and the like, as you can see, that equates to considerably more than 50% of overall government spending. Around about 60% of all UK government spending is in the health, education and welfare spending sector. You can make cuts or reductions in the other part of the multicoloured pie there, but there aren't any huge departments that you can really find savings in. In short, if you want to get government expenditure down or under control, it is damned difficult to do so unless you're willing to tackle that blue slice of the pie. You can squeeze defence, you can squeeze the Arts Council, local government, you could potentially cut down on the foreign aid commitment, but really the major part of it is health, education and welfare. It's not going to change in this Parliament either. Most likely over the next 5 years, in which it is the intention of this government to spend £4,000 billion of taxpayers' money. Health, welfare and education on most estimates will still be more than half of overall government expenditure, probably around about 56% or something like that. And within the welfare budget, the most substantial part of those three, the biggest single item of expenditure, welfare or social protection or transfer payments, call it what you will. This is how this breaks down. Within that, pensions, state pensions and other benefits to pensioners are easily the biggest slice. That's again the blue slice here, just within our overall welfare budget of £200 billion or so. The unemployment benefit is that tiny little yellow slice of pie. Support for social exclusion issues, sickness and disability, yes, you could perhaps ramp that down as well, but the welfare budget being the biggest budget, pensions and support for the elderly are easily the largest part of it. Again, triple locked. That blue slice ain't going to go down. State pensions are going to go up with inflation at 2.5% or with wage growth, whichever is the highest. So we saw last week the pension going up well above inflation. Indeed, if we are to believe that inflation is presently negative, then anyone claiming a state pension got a real boost. We've got a problem here because not just with regard to the state pensions, but with regard to who is going to pay them. This is a projection, there's no certainty in this, of what the percentage of the population will be over the age of 65. You just heard from Jim Mellon in the previous presentation that the first person to live to the age of 150 has already been born. Living to 100 or more is going to become more and more common. You pay your money and takes your choice on what you think likely medical advances are going to be. So this is only a projection. But this shows in the UK, France, Germany, Spain and Italy the projected proportion of the population that will be over the age of 65 over the course of the next 40 years or so. Actually, the position in the UK, which is the blue line at the bottom, not quite as severe as the position in other Western European countries, but still on an upward trend. Now, it's important to say here that we shouldn't sort of treat 65 as people's drop-dead date. It might be in future that people over the age of 65 are more likely to be in the workforce than they have been historically. Perhaps people will work to the age of 80 or 85. But as a general rule of thumb, as a prediction, and certainly as far as state benefits go, that number going up is likely to involve people exiting the labour market, no longer being contributors to the tax system, and also involves people being eligible for a range of benefits, be that state pensions or other things. So this upward trend in the proportion of the elderly over the long term puts really quite huge pressure on our finances, and I think certainly makes the triple lock on the state pension unsustainable for more than a few years. And if you were to look at projected ratios between the number of people in the workforce and the number of people who have exited the workforce in virtue of retiring, this is almost the mirror image of it. So around about today we've got about somewhere in the region of 3.6 workers for each retiree in the United Kingdom. Over the course of the next 40 or so years, that's going to drop to roughly 2 workers for each retiree. So the burden of providing for those in old age, or indeed for state financing more generally, is going to fall more heavily on fewer shoulders. Again, the UK is the blue line there, but the picture is roughly mirrored France, Italy and Germany. Our problem isn't just expenditure, it's our overall debt. This shows you the explicit listed debt in the United Kingdom as a proportion of GDP. As you can see, it spikes up at the time of the financial crash, where we kept spending without getting in the tax revenues. Once your economy has gone backwards 5 or 6%, and you don't make cuts, it tends to go upwards. But it's been a pretty consistent problem. This graph starts in 1975. It's ebbed and flowed, but the consequence of the financial crash is we now seem to be in a different place altogether. George Osborne, the government, is apparently relatively confident that we are going to begin to see that just begin to edge downwards from around about 80%, perhaps down to 70% or so of GDP being the explicit on-balance sheet debt. But even if his rosy and optimistic projections last Wednesday are accurate, we would be stabilising at a level of debt that is really way beyond what we've seen over most of our lifetimes, where national debt has been 50%, 40% of GDP, those sort of numbers. It is way out of kilter and way high. But there's a deeper problem than this. That is simply the on-balance sheet debt. If you start to look at how we need to deal with overall liabilities, so our on-balance sheet debt does not include what we're likely to pay out in 10 or 20 years' time. You would obviously have to list that if you were a private company, an insurance company, and the government doesn't have to. This is an indication the United Kingdom's just at the bottom here of the percentage of present GDP that we would have to spend to tackle our explicit debt. Those are the charcoaly grey bars. But the implicit debt, the promises for generous public sector pensions, state pensions for everybody when they get into their 60s, whether they live to 120 or whatever else, that is the real problem. Promises over the long term that we could get out of. We could rescind, but if you believe that the government is going to meet its contractual obligations to future pensioners, to those who are presently working in the public sector and are promised gold-plated pensions when they retire, the problem is substantially greater. This is actually going back about 5 years. I'm afraid I can't find updated numbers for 2015, but just to give you an indication, going back 5 years, the official debt, the number of the explicit debt, the absolute listed debt of our government 5 years ago, about 54% of GDP. But if you start to look at the liabilities coming down the line, public sector pensions, pensions for current pensioners for the rest of their lives, the future state pension for current workers, you're probably looking at a real debt 5 years ago was somewhere in the region of £5 trillion. So 6 or 7 times the explicit debt if we're going to meet those liabilities. I think on most estimates today, that's now reckoned to be about £6 trillion if we are to meet all of our liabilities, or roughly speaking, £100,000 for every man, woman and child who live in the United Kingdom. We're not particularly surprising or an outlier or in any way unique in this regard. Jim, in his previous presentation, was talking about the problems in the eurozone. This shows you what debt was in 2007, just prior to the financial crisis, and again in 2010. The picture hasn't changed markedly since 2010, but as you can see there, the United Kingdom about in the middle, the orange graph showing you debt in 2010, just over 80% of GDP. a little worse than the Netherlands, about the same as France, not quite as bad as Portugal, not quite as bad as Italy, and nowhere near as bad as the basket case that is Greece, but nevertheless a picture of heavy indebtedness, explicit indebtedness, pretty much right across the European Union, and the UK more or less is a median modal typical example of what we're seeing across the EU. Now, one suggestion put forward by a range of politicians and commentators is that we can solve the spending problem in Britain. All of these commitments to generous state pensions, ring fencing, the health service, ratcheting up foreign aid, if only we were willing to raise the tax burden, presumably particularly on the better off. Couldn't we just find some way of bringing in more money to the Treasury in some way at some point to meet these liabilities? Well, this graph, which I found on the Guardian's website, not a newspaper that I'm usually in sympathy with, I think tells a fascinating story. The blue line at the bottom, which edges up and down, is the proportion of national income that governments have managed to bring in taxation. The lowest it falls to is 31.6%, but it's hovering roughly around the 35% of national income mark. It's sometimes a little heavier than that, sometimes a little lower, never got as high as 40% of national income, never dipped below 30% of national income. So although that line looks quite zigzaggy and all over the place, actually over a 50-year period, it has been remarkably consistent. Whether you have had governments of a Labour persuasion, a Conservative persuasion, whether you have had governments with substantial majorities, with no majorities, whether you've had coalition governments, whatever the flavour or political mix of the UK government at the time, you can more or less and fairly say that about 35% of GDP is what you can bring in taxation. And more or less everything has been tried within the last 50 years. Any remotely credible, sane portfolio of taxation has been tried. This reflects a period in which we have had top tax rates as low as 40% and as high as 83%, where we have had varying VAT rates, where we have tried to tax cigarettes, alcohol, you name it, in various different ways. We've had high levels of inheritance tax or low levels of inheritance tax. Everything has kind of been tried. And I wouldn't go so far as to say it's an iron rule, but I think it would be fair to say that the lesson of recent history is you cannot tax much more than about 35% out of the British population, whatever you try. If you get a bit lucky, you might get up to 37, 38. If you get a bit unlucky from the government's perspective, or you actually have a determined strategy of forcing down tax, maybe it goes to about 31% or so, but 35% is roughly where you're at. The red line shows how much government has spent as a proportion of GDP, projected onto 2017 over the last 50 years. And as you can see, that is substantially higher in almost all years and in almost all cases than the tax revenue we are bringing in. Now, there's a little bit of a cheat here in what I'm saying. It is true that governments can spend consistently a bit more than they bring in tax revenue. Firstly, they have other methods of generating revenue, not usually particularly efficiently, but nevertheless, it's not only taxation that's the only revenue that comes into a government. If you have a state-run service that sells products, those are revenues that come in to the government. And if you are confident that your economy is going to consistently grow at 2 or 3% a year, then you can each year spend a little more than you're bringing in. In the same way, on a micro level, if you were very, very confident that your salary was going to increase by, say, 5% a year for the rest of your life, ad infinitum, it wouldn't be that much of a problem if you were overspending a little beyond your salary this year, because you know next year it's going to go up and up and up. So it's a little bit of a cheat, this graph, but I think still tells us an important lesson. that in very broad terms, as a rule of thumb, over the long term, you can't really spend more than about 35, 36% of GDP, perhaps as much as 37% of GDP in the state sector, if you want to have sustainable public finances. Sure, you can get away with it for a year, for 2, for 5 maybe, but can you really get away with it over 50 years, consistently spending enormously more than you are bringing in tax revenues? Again, looking at tax revenues as a percentage of GDP, the United Kingdom is the blue line here, and very similar really to what used to be the EU 15, because I'm going back to 1975, that's back in the day when there were only a handful of members of the common market, and the OECD total is shown in that green line. So most sophisticated, mature, modern capitalist economies, similar picture to the United Kingdom, that you're going to be bringing in somewhere around 35% or so in tax revenues. Maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more, but a remarkably consistent picture right across the OECD. What's the contribution of the top end? One suggestion is that in order to try and raise taxes, it's that the rich, that the successful are not paying enough. They're not really picking up the share of the burden that they could. Well, this shows, and this is just the changes since the autumn statement. The light blue graphs show you that the light blue bars show you what's paid by the bottom quintile, the poorest 20% of the population, the next 20%, the middle 20%, the relatively affluent, and the top 20%. And as you can see, the people in the fifth quintile, the richest 20%, the highest earning 20% of the UK population, are picking up a very substantial share of tax receipts, a bit more than half, and those at the bottom end paying very little. This is a very, very progressive tax system that we have. Very progressive. You can think that's a good thing, or you can think that's a bad thing, but there is no question that those at the top end are picking up the largest part of the tax. There's, I think, a lesson that we can learn from recent UK tax history here. Back in the days of the Jim Callaghan Labour government, before the Thatcher Revolution, the top rate of income tax was 83%. There were actually ways on certain savings income you could pay even more than that, but the formal standard figure was 83% was the top rate of tax. And in terms of who's contributing what, this graph this pie shows you in the blue part, that's the 11% in that light blue, that was the contribution of income tax paid by the top 1% of earners. The top 1% of earners with that colossally high tax rate were contributing 11% of income tax revenues. The maroon, purpley area shows you what's contributed by the next 9% of taxpayers. So those two combined shows you the total paid by the top 10% of earners in total. The top 1% of earners contributing 11%, the next tranche of earners contributing 24%. So the top 10% back then contributing 35%, a little more than a third of income tax receipts, and all of the rest, those middle earners, low earners, contributing 65%, roughly 2/3 of all income tax receipts, with a very, very high top rate of tax. That's what you could squeeze out of the highest earners. Of course, under the Thatcher administration, they swiftly reduced the top income tax rate to 60%. And this is what happened, counterintuitively to some people, by lowering the top rate of tax, by lowering the percentage that the very affluent, wealthy, high earners had to contribute. Actually, their proportion of income tax receipts edged up a bit, certainly for the top 1% of earners. By cutting the top tax rate from 83 to 60, your top 1% of earners were now contributing 14% of all income tax revenue, up from 11. The next 9%, relatively successful earners, 21%, and the rest of the population, 65%. Slashing the top rate didn't actually change, particularly the burden of taxation in terms of who was contributing what to the pie. If anything, it successfully got more money out of the super affluent and the very, very highest earners. Encouraged by this development, the Conservative government of the 80s went further still and cut that top tax rate from 60% to 40%. And this is what then happened in terms of the contribution of earners to the overall income tax pie. By having more than halved the top rate of income tax, we were actually then more than doubling the proportion that we were getting from the top 1% of earners, and the top 10% of earners now accounted for more than half of all income tax revenue. Halve the top rate of tax, and lo and behold, it's not the rich who are getting away with it. Suddenly the rich are contributing substantially more. What can we learn and where do we need to turn to? Because the state of the public finances is pretty dire. The debt is never going to be repaid. We are still spending beyond our means. If we are successful, if George Osborne is successful in balancing the budget by 2020, we will have had 20 consecutive years of budget deficits. No surplus would have been run, and he will only be running incredibly modest surpluses after that of 0.1%, 0.2%, that sort of level of GDP. It is nearly impossible for us to squeeze more than 35 or 36%, as I've shown you, out of the tax system. If you start to try and find ways to go higher than that, you get people either exiting the labour market or potentially even exiting the country. It's a bleak picture, but I think there is a part of the world that we can learn from. The ultimate free market experiment, as I call it, has more or less been tried in Hong Kong. It's not a perfect country. You can't replicate exactly what's happened in Hong Kong and just apply it to the United Kingdom, but I think there are some good lessons that we could learn from and draw from. Hong Kong, after the end of the Second World War, was about on a par with a typical African country. It was GDP per capita was about sort of the mid-ish of Africa. Since then, however, they have experimented with very low tax and very low spend. Income tax rates of about 15%, top corporate tax rate 16.5%. There is no tax on capital gains, there is no inheritance tax, and the overall tax burden in the Hong Kong economy is around about 14% of GDP, not the 35, 36, 37% that you tend to find in the United Kingdom or across the EU. Less than half that, 14% is the size of the state sector, remarkably smaller. So government spending less than a fifth of the overall economy, whereas in the UK it's still slightly more than 40%, and a few years ago was touching about half. Just to put that in some sort of context, if you've got Hong Kong spending around 15 to 20% of GDP, and typically those countries in the world which are growing the fastest at the moment are in about the same sort of range, 15, 16, 17, 20, 21% of GDP. Most economists and economic historians agree that if you were to look back to the Soviet Union's history, that about 70% of expenditure was state spending. It's hard to measure exactly. The data records aren't completely robust. There was a big black market economy, but somewhere around that level was what the Soviet Union was spending in the state sector. 7 out of 10 of all expenditure was in the public sector. And the UK and much of Western Europe is around the 40–45% level. So we have presently positioned ourselves in terms of the size of government spending as a proportion of GDP about equidistantly between the former Soviet Union and the fastest growing economies on planet Earth. I think that it's open to question about whether that is a long-term, sustainable or at least sensible position on that spectrum of government spending. Hong Kong, virtually no public debt. Budget surpluses have typically been maintained. Very light touch regulatory structure. Labour markets are pretty free and flexible. Working hours and wages are set by the market, not by the government. Relative monetary stability. Some subsidies for small and medium-sized businesses, but very trivial. Very open trading economy. There aren't colossal tariffs. Foreign banks, for example, are treated almost identically to domestic banks. That's been the experiment they've been running in Hong Kong more or less since 1945. Sometimes the government's been a bit more interfering, sometimes it's been a bit more hands-off. The effects have been pretty remarkable. This goes back to 1960. GDP per capita in 2010 US dollars terms, tiny in 1960. I mean, an absolute basket case country, an impoverished country, now up to a little over 52,000 US dollars being the average income of a citizen of Hong Kong. Put another way, if you were to go back to around about the 1980s, the average person in Hong Kong would have been on about a third of the average Brit, and now they're about 50% better off than the average Brit. It is a spectacular, colossal success story if economic growth and the wealth and prosperity of your population is your aim. No other country in the world, with the conceivable exception of Singapore, which has tried a very similar strategy, has managed to achieve what Hong Kong has achieved. And the recipe is pretty clear. Very low tax, very limited government spending, very low regulatory interference in the economy, and your economy takes off. Stable public finances, an open trading environment. Just a comparison between ourselves and Hong Kong. So over, roughly speaking, the last 20 years, again my figures go to 2010, Hong Kong GDP grew by 196.9%. In effect, the size of the Hong Kong economy trebled in 20 years. The UK didn't do appallingly. The UK economy grew by about 50%. But the comparison is still stark. If you really want substantial economic growth, the Hong Kong model appears to work substantially better than the Western European model. Okay, there are big differences. Population of Hong Kong around about 7 million. Population of UK around not far off 10 times that, at 64 million. Total GDP obviously correspondingly smaller in Hong Kong. We are still a substantial economy, about the 5th or 6th largest on planet Earth. But the GDP per capita, the number you really need to look at if you care about the wealth and prosperity of your population, Hong Kong, as I say, roughly speaking, 50% better off than the United Kingdom in US dollars terms. Unemployment a bit lower in Hong Kong, depends how you measure that, but people of working age who aren't in the labour market, roughly speaking, about half the unemployment rate in Hong Kong. Government spend, these are 2010 levels, I should say, but the growth rate in the UK was going backwards slightly in 2010, steaming along nicely in Hong Kong. And again, this key number, this what is the government spending as a proportion of total GDP in Hong Kong, around about 18%, and back in 2010 in the UK, touching 50%. That has fallen a little now, it's now in the low to mid 40s. The tax burden, as I was showing you on the previous graph, 35% in the United Kingdom, about the statistical average of what we've been able to raise over the past 50 years or so. Hong Kong, about 14% of GDP collected in taxation. So I think that the picture painted on Wednesday by the Chancellor of the Exchequer was probably an unduly rosy one. Let's hope in some ways that he's right, that we continue to have growth in the UK of about 2.5% or so between now and the end of the decade. That's not an heroically optimistic assumption. Long-term growth rates of about 2% or a little more are unheard of, but it would be unusual to see us sustain those sort of levels consistently over a 6, 7 or 8 year period. There's not much margin of error. I don't think that many people are expecting growth to be on the higher end of those projections. Even if the rosy news that he gave us on Wednesday turns out to be accurate, even if we sustain economic growth at 2.5% or so, even if, at least from George Osborne's perspective and the government's perspective, interest rates remain unbelievably low and therefore the cost of servicing our debt remains relatively low, even if that optimistic outlook is right and turns out to be accurate, we still have some serious systemic problems in our public finances, which are not going to go away, even indeed if those sort of growth forecasts are sustained in totality over a generation rather than over 4 or 5 years. A total UK debt that, if the government was a private company and had to list its liabilities, not just its balance sheet debt, of somewhere around £5 or £6 trillion, continuing to spend more than we are bringing in, a long-term target of only getting down the size of the state sector to somewhere around the mid to high 30s in terms of the proportion of national income, and no strategic approach at all about dealing with long-term liabilities and commitments. Pensions, state pensions that will go up and up and up, an apparent commitment that the health service will be funded above inflation year on year on year, a commitment now that 2% of GDP must be spent on defence, irrespective of our actual defence needs. So if we're apparently next year double our GDP, apparently we need to double the amount that we spend on protecting these islands. A ratchet effect on foreign aid, 0.7% of GDP, and effective political commitments to retaining the wider welfare spending and education spending, an unsustainable position over the next 20 or 30 years. We can't simply tackle this by attempting to balance the books after 20 years of running budget deficits. We actually need to tackle the structure of government spending and taxation. I think there is a way out of it. I think were we to learn some of the lessons from Hong Kong, it's not to say that you can translate everything from a small but successful economy many thousands of miles away to the United Kingdom, but I think if we were to learn some of those lessons, we could see really substantial economic growth in the United Kingdom. But the shift of thinking and the shift of emphasis that will be required to do that goes far, far beyond any of these discussions about the age of austerity and savage cuts and the rest of it. If we are going to continue to have the government spending what it is spending at present in rough terms, if we're going to actually see a supposedly austere Chancellor see government spending increase over the course of this Parliament, then I wouldn't go so far to say that the United Kingdom is doomed, but it is certainly not doing the best it can in terms of increasing its GDP, in terms of enriching its population, and in terms of looking after future generations. I often say to people who are worried about the state of the natural environment, or particularly climate change. I don't know if you're worried about climate change. I'm not sure I'm enormously worried about it. But if you are in any way concerned about climate change, global warming, and the natural environment that we are going to leave to our children and grandchildren, if that concerns you in any size, shape or form, you should be apoplectic about the state of the public finances that we're handing on to the next generation. They are dire. They are unsustainable. And at some point, we're going to have an approach to UK public finances that isn't just about trimming and trying to balance the books over a 5 or 10-year programme, that is actually about radically reducing the size of expenditure in some of the huge areas of spending: health, welfare and education. If we've got the courage and the bravery to move in that direction, I actually think the long-term future is rosier even than George Osborne predicted last Wednesday. But if we're going to tinker, if we're going to sustain huge levels of spending and tax to the maximum 36 or 37% of GDP coming in tax revenues, then 2% economic growth is about the best we will experience, and that will not be sufficient to meet the liabilities that this government and previous governments have made to the population. I'm sorry to be a prophet of doom. That's what economists are for. I think there is a solution. It is a low tax, low spend, less regulation solution, but we have to have the courage to embrace that far beyond anything presently being presented in mainstream British politics. I hope I haven't depressed you too much, and thank you very much for your time and attention.